Hello, all of my history-loving friends. Welcome back. This is Madam Morbid. It is a history channel. I talk about all kinds of historical topics, the only rule being the people that I profile are dead. If you like what you see in this video, please like it, please share it, check out my other videos. Liking videos tells the algorithm that it should share it with other people, and it helps get the video out there in front of an audience. I really appreciate your support. So today we are continuing our Jack the Ripper victims series. We will be talking about victim number 3, Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth Stride was born in Torslanda, Sweden on November 27, 1843, the daughter of Gustav Eriksson and Beata. Elizabeth's full name, Elizabeth Gustafsdotter. So her father's name was Gustav, and she was his daughter. Just as her father's name was Eric's son, so his father's name was Eric. Kind of a neat way they did names. She was their second daughter. Her father was a farmer, so she would have grown up doing the chores. Her father had cows, pigs, chickens, and a horse. He grew flax, potatoes, grains. She would have grown up working hard. They were a devout Lutheran family. She did not know how to write. She did know how to read. In 1860, Elizabeth went to live as a live-in maid in the home of Lars Fredrik Olsen, his wife, and his 2 children. This was a regular thing young women did. They would go and do this service to basically be an apprentice to learn how to run their own household. He lived in Majorna, which was a suburb of Gothenburg. I don't know if this was the only family she worked for or if she moved to another family later, but by 1864, she had left service and had been gotten pregnant by someone. History has lost who it might have been. It was common for a woman in service to get into relationships, whether they be consensual. It could also have been a rape situation. It was common for men to even have kept mistresses where they would have a separate home for their mistress. Some of these relationships were over in months. Some lasted for years. How she got into this situation, we don't know. We will never know. There were laws back then trying to address the spread of venereal disease. Lots of countries had them. Even though they had differences between countries, they all had the same thing in common in that they believed women were responsible for it, prostitutes specifically. This law that required any woman who was a prostitute to register her name, her address. It's supposed to affect sex workers, but what ends up happening is they lump all women into that sex worker category. So there were basically 2 lists. There were lists of women that they kept that were of known prostitutes and sex workers, and then there were other lists of women who had lecherous living. This is going to be women, and actually ladies, if you would qualify under this law as a lecherous woman, put it down in the comments. I am a lecherous woman, so if you are seen out at night, you are considered a lecherous woman. If you are seen alone with a man, you are a lecherous woman. Both of those get me. If you are single and pregnant, if you are a kept mistress, if you fall into any of those categories, then you can be picked up by the police and added to this list. If you are on this list, you must go to the police station and have a gynecological exam twice a week, in which they check out to see if you are healthy or not. In March 1864, Elizabeth is added to this list. She is 6 months pregnant. She could no longer hide her condition. The police may have already been watching her, or maybe a neighbor turned her in, but she was picked up. She was taken to the police station where she was checked out by the police surgeon. Women who went in for these exams went in through the back of the police station. They were stripped naked and they were lined up single file to wait to see the doctor. If the wait was going to be a long one, sometimes they would be required to wait outdoors in the courtyard, standing there naked, freezing to death in the Swedish cold with a policeman guarding them. A lot of effort was made to make this absolutely as humiliating and horrifying as possible. On April 4th, during her weekly inspection, Elizabeth was found to have evidence of syphilis. She was sent directly to the venereal disease cure house, where she would receive treatment that amounted to injecting poisonous substances into her body, which would, we now know, do absolutely nothing to treat her condition. It would have been a torturous experience. Because of the poisons they were putting into her body, she went into labor early. She had a baby girl at 7 months, stillborn, which would have been devastating. Also, this facility wasn't so much a hospital as a prison. They were referred to as inmates. They were prisoners. They were literally locked in this building and forcibly given these treatments. There was a lot of overcrowding in these facilities. Women were sharing beds. If they were even more overcrowded than that, women would have been sleeping on the floor. She was admitted on April 4th. She was allowed to return home May 13th. Rules that Elizabeth had to follow being a part of this list. She had to be indoors by 11. She had to dress decently when out in public. She could not linger in the doors or windows of her home, and she could not call out to passerbys. Basically, she's being lectured as a prostitute. Every single woman on this list, no matter why they were on it, whether they had been raped, whether they were just had an accident in a consensual relationship, they were all treated like they were trash. What ends up happening by being on this list, she literally cannot get legitimate work now. So what this has done is it's taken a woman who was not a prostitute and made her to where her only option to make money is to actually become a prostitute. Though she doesn't have symptoms at the time, she is contagious. And as she becomes an actual sex worker at this point, she is spreading it to every customer she has. August 30th, she's again showing symptoms of syphilis, so she goes back into the cure house. She's let out in mid-September. Again, by November, she's got symptoms again. And a month or so after that, she's declared cured. This is when she enters the latent stage of the disease, meaning she's no longer contagious, she no longer has symptoms, but at some point, years down the road, this disease is going to rear its ugly head again, and it's going to attack her nervous system and her brain. After her final stay in the cure house, a husband and wife, Maria and Karl Weisner, he was a musician in the Gothenburg Orchestra, they chose her to be their live-in maid through a program in which a fallen woman could be taken in for only the cost of room and board to work as a servant. This is a legitimate way to get off of this police register list. What would happen is Maria, a few days after she took in Liz, wrote a letter vouching for her character, that she would take responsibility for Elizabeth's actions moving forward. I feel like this family, Maria and Karl, must have been really nice people. First of all, they got her off of this list, and probably they were responsible for helping her leave Sweden and get to London. More than likely, she found the family that she would go work for in London through contacts that she made through Karl and his orchestra buddies. There was an area of Gothenburg known as Little London, where all of these British musicians gathered. There were so many of them that that neighborhood was called that. And so he probably connected her with somebody who was going back to London and needed a servant. This was ideal for her because she could not escape her past. Everywhere she went, anytime she went anywhere in the city, people are going to recognize her. They're going to know you were on that list, even if she wasn't anymore. So leaving the country was an ideal way to start her life over. Her family had cut her off. Her sister no longer talked to her. In order to save her family from their shame, she pretended like her parents were dead. Her mother was, her dad wasn't. So she was just telling people they were dead so that they didn't have to deal with that shame. On February 7th, 1866, she stepped onto the ship with her new employers to move to London. We have no idea who those employers were. They must have been very well off and important because she was working in the Hyde Park district, where it was a swanky neighborhood where a lot of important people were living. She only worked for this family for a couple of years before something happened. Really all anyone can do is speculate. But whatever happened, they did allow her to get another job. They must have given her a reference. Winter of 1869, she is working for a widow named Elizabeth Bond, who had a lodging house on Tottenham Court Road. Somehow, as she's living off Tottenham Court Road, she meets John Stride. John Stride is quite a bit older than her. He is a carpenter. He's about 47 years old. He had never been married. His father had been a very important man in Sheerness who had worked in real estate. There was a whole neighborhood named for him, and he owned all of these homes. Her future husband John, had given his early years, his youth, to his father. He had stayed living with him, he had taken care of him, and at this point, by 1869, he had moved to London to start his life at 47 years old. He was getting a little old to do carpentry. He was a Methodist, he was a teetotaler, and he really enjoyed going to coffee houses. It's possible that's where he met Elizabeth. They also could have just met in the street. No idea. But by winter of 1869, they were engaged. They were married March 7th, 1869 at the Church of St. Giles in the Field. He wanted to open a coffee house. He did. He had some savings. They opened a coffee shop in the East End near the docks. One of the things they were competing with, though, is the pub. Coffee houses did not serve alcohol. And working men like alcohol. So he's hoping there are enough teetotalers like himself to keep the business afloat. And it appears this may have been an issue. They have to move locations at some point. And this probably put them into some debt. Well, his father dies in September of 1873, and he must have been a horrible, vindictive old man. He left out of his will every single child of 9 who had moved away and abandoned him, including John, who had probably done more for him than any of his children, who had sacrificed for him. And John got nothing. And within a couple of months of this happening, of him dying and them finding out he had been completely cut out of the will, they had to give up the coffee house. He may have been depending on that inheritance, and then he didn't get it. And this appears to have strained the marriage, because not only are they having severe financial problems, but also Elizabeth hasn't had any children. We don't really know. Maybe she was having miscarriages. Maybe she never conceived at all. It was probably directly a result of her illness, which John probably did not know about. Now, she's not contagious in this latent stage, so she hasn't given it to him, but it probably was keeping her from having a child. Around 1877, she leaves for a while. She's sleeping on the streets. She's arrested for vagrancy. She returns to him for a little while. They reconcile. This happens a few times. And by 1880, John is sick. And she realizes he can't take care of her anymore. And this is where Liz gets really interesting to me. She becomes a con artist. Hey, when you're a woman in this period in Victorian London, you gotta do what you have to do because the law is against you in just about every single way possible. So what she does is, on September 3rd, 1878, there had been a horrible disaster in the Thames, a maritime disaster. A pleasure cruiser with more than 800 people on it, coming from Sheerness. They had been spending the day in Sheerness and they were returning back to London. Has no idea that it is in the path of a coal steamer, a massive coal steamer called the Bywell Castle. The Bywell Castle broadsides it, and it hits it around the engine room and literally splits the Princess Alice in 2. It sinks so fast. Each section sinks so fast. Hardly anyone has time to save themselves. They don't get to launch the lifeboats. The crew can literally do nothing to save so many of these people. Women who are weighted down by this really heavy clothing just sink straight to the bottom. They have no chance at all. It is so heartbreaking. Because her husband's family is from Sheerness, Elizabeth is probably picking up some pretty detailed stories from survivors. She's also reading about this extensively in the newspaper. She invents a pretty convincing story. And maybe even as early as 1878, she starts telling this story to people. And she tells it so many times and so convincingly that a lot of people who know her believe it. Here is her story. Her husband, John, worked on the Princess Alice. She and 2 of her 9 children joined him that day at work for the voyage. When the collision happened, she became separated from John and the children. He valiantly was trying to save the children, and unfortunately, they all went to a watery grave. She found herself inside one of Princess Alice's collapsing funnels. But she was able to get herself out, and she saw a rope or a line of some sort trailing from the Bywell Castle, which she grabbed a hold of and was able to pull herself on board. As she was climbing this rope, the man in front of her inadvertently kicked her in the face, which gave her an injury to her lip, to her palate. It was so hard to live as a widow. Her remaining 7 children, which she was unable to care for and support, were in an orphanage run by the Swedish church. So she's telling the story, and people are thinking, oh, we have to help this poor woman. So out of the goodness of her heart, they would give her money, believing that she had survived this horrific disaster. This wasn't the only scam she pulled. In 1883, she met a woman named Mary Malcolm. Mary had worked as a tailoress, and perhaps years of squinting at these tiny needles and had destroyed her eyesight. So she sees Elizabeth across the room. I think Mary also really liked the drink. I think she met her in a pub, so who knows how much she had to drink that night. But she sees her. Her estranged sister's name was Elizabeth Watts. Well, she sees and calls out Elizabeth. And Elizabeth Stride turns and looks at her and answers, because her name is Elizabeth. Instead of correcting Mary about her mistake, Elizabeth just runs with it. And she starts combining her real story to try to connect it to this Mary's sister's story. And it was pretty easy for Mary to believe, because her sister had led kind of a crazy life. She had been married more than once, at least twice. She had spent some time in an asylum. So it wasn't too much of a stretch to believe that this destitute woman was actually her sister. Her actual sister had also lost a husband in a shipwreck, which fit nicely with this story that Elizabeth had made up about her surviving a shipwreck and losing a husband. So it just was one of these crazy situations, and for 5 years, all the way up until Elizabeth's death, she is pulling this con on Mary. Mary meets her once a week, every Sunday, to give her 2 shillings. Sometimes she gave her clothing. You know, Mary probably was a little embarrassed by how long she let this scam go on. And on the stand, she acts like she actually had her doubts. But who knows? When you're in that situation and you feel like a fool, it's really easy to act like you knew. Oh, I knew all along. I'm not that stupid. Anyway, during this time, Elizabeth had a certain lodging house she preferred over others. She always came back to 32 Flower and Dean Street. It was as close as she would ever get to having a home base. She didn't have a lot of friends. There were not very many people who knew a whole lot about her. Because she was doing all of this con artist stuff, there really weren't people who knew the real Elizabeth Stride. The only person who came close was a man who worked at the Swedish charitable house, where Elizabeth often came in to seek assistance. And because of the logbook they kept there, he had a lot of actual information about Elizabeth Stride and was pretty much the only person who knew anything about her. His name was Sven Olsen, and he will come up later. In 1884, Elizabeth's husband John dies of a heart ailment. He had been sick for some time, since 1880. And her life really goes downhill after this. This has been true of every victim I have covered so far. When their husbands die or fall out of the picture, their lives literally go bad. So whatever he's been giving her stops. For a while, she does live with another man named Michael Kidney. They are on and off again for several years. But from all accounts, he was probably abusive. He was also really into alcohol. Elizabeth had really turned to alcohol use in the later years of her life as well. Again, these are women living in just the worst situation possible. And if she was having to turn to prostitution now and then, wouldn't you need a drink to try to get through having to do something so distasteful? She is one who clearly had a history in actually having prostitution. There is real evidence that Elizabeth had to turn to this. One thing that we see in Elizabeth's records is that she really has a change in behavior beginning in around 1886. This is going to coincide to be about 20 years after she got syphilis. And it kind of fits nicely for her to enter into that end stage affecting the nervous system and brain part of her syphilis. People who enter this stage of syphilis can have dementia. They won't remember things from minute to minute. They may start using horrible language they never used before. They can get violent. And she starts to be arrested more around this point for things like disorderly conduct, for cursing and lashing out violently at people. She's picked up for prostitution once in 1887. That's the only one on her record. She also starts having epileptic incidents. At the death inquest, Mary brings up these epileptic fits because she found them strange because her sister never had epilepsy. She also was released by the police a few times because of having these seizures in front of them. And they see this, they must not have thought it was faking, because I'm sure they had seen everything when it came to people trying to not be taken to jail. So it's very possible that her brain and nervous system were being affected by the syphilis that she had. Shortly before her death, Elizabeth finally breaks up with Michael Kidney. She had complained to the police at least twice for his violent behavior towards her. As usual, she goes to 32 Flower and Dean Street, which was her favorite lodging house. Her last day on earth, September 29th, 1888, the lodging house had been whitewashed. And she and another woman spent the day cleaning the rooms. She was given 6 shillings for the work she did that day. She went to the Queen's Head pub and had a drink. She returned to the lodging house between 6:30 and 7 in the evening. She kind of cleaned herself up. She borrowed a brush from someone else who was staying at the lodging house so she could clean up the only outfit she owned. And then she left for the evening. No one has any idea where she was going. She behaved as if she was going to meet someone and that she cared about what she looked like. The only thing we know for sure is that the coroner found that that evening she had eaten some potatoes, some bread, and some cheese. She had probably had some alcohol as well. She had a single rose with some ferns, a little corsage attached to her bodice. Whether that was given to her by someone else or she got it for herself, who knows? So whoever she was meeting, it seems she really cared what she looked like. I don't feel like you would doll yourself up for a John or care what your breath was like. So maybe she was hoping to start another long-term relationship, to get a man who could take care of her. Because again, that's what you needed when you didn't have a husband. I'm actually going to read a quote to you right now about what her dress looked like. This was in the newspaper. She was wearing a rusty black dress of a cheap kind of sateen, over which was a black diagonal worsted jacket with fur trimming. She also had a black bonnet which was too big for her, so she had stuffed an old newspaper, or folded newspaper, in the back to make it fit better. Now, the only man who we can probably definitively say saw her, and we know it was her, is a man named Israel Schwartz. He was a Hungarian. He did not speak English, so all of his account was given through an interpreter. It was around 12:45 a.m. He's walking down Commercial Street, and he turns onto Burner. As he's walking down Burner, he hears a man and a woman fighting. The woman has her back to the gate to Dutfield's yard. So the man grabs the woman. He turns her and he throws her. And she cries out 3 times. They weren't loud cries, but he thinks he's seeing a domestic situation that he doesn't want to get involved with. As he's approaching, a man comes out of a pub lighting a pipe and approaches him, and it frightens him. He doesn't know or even necessarily think the man is with the man fighting with the woman, but he's freaked out enough to really not want to find out. So he turns and he runs. And as he's doing so, the man attacking the woman yells out, "Lipski." Lipski was a derogatory term around this time that was being used against Jewish people in London. A man named Moses Lipski the year before had been convicted of murdering a woman who lived in his lodging house, and he had been hanged for the offense. It had Whether or not Moses Lipsky actually killed anybody, I don't know. I haven't really looked into the case, but it caused a lot of anti-Semitism in London around this time. And so people were using this term against Jewish people. He may have thought that Israel Schwartz was a Jewish person. He runs off and does not see anything else that happens. But about 15 minutes after this, her body is found. Elizabeth is found in Dutfield's yard. She has her face toward the wall. She is lying in a somewhat of a fetal position. The man who found her thought that maybe she was asleep. She had the breath mints clutched in her hand. Again, she had the corsage on. You know, there's still a lot of debate as to whether Israel Schwartz saw Jack the Ripper. This night would be known as the double event because later, Catherine Eddowes on the very same evening would also be killed, and she would be mutilated more than any of the victims before her. And the explanation has always been that Israel interrupted the Ripper, who only had time to cut her throat, but did not have time to do any of the mutilations. So he made up for the lack of being able to do that on Catherine Eddowes. Again, this is just a theory. There's still a lot of people who talk about whether or not she was actually killed by Jack the Ripper, or if it was a dispute with someone else in her life. Maybe it was a jilted lover that no one knew about, because she never shared anything about her life with anyone, and she was always making up stories about who she was. She reinvented herself however she wanted. But she is included in the canonical 5 victims who are considered to have actually been killed by the Jack the Ripper. And if she was, Israel Schwartz is probably the only person that we can definitively say saw the face of Jack the Ripper. Now, he described him as a middle-aged man dressed, I don't know if I want to say nice, but I mean, he didn't look destitute. He had a little mustache. He had a peaked cap. Younger man, maybe in his early 30s. The saddest thing about Elizabeth Stride's death is that there was no one to mourn her. Only one person on Earth, at the time of her death, actually knew anything about the real Elizabeth Stride, and that was Sven Olsen, who worked at the Swedish church where she went sometimes to seek aid. In the ledger, he had information about the real Elizabeth Stride. And when the police came to him to ask about the hymnal that they found in her things and asked him to come and identify her body, he accepted. He had given her that hymnal himself. It's interesting she didn't pawn it. Something about it meant something to her, and at one point she had even asked a friend to watch it and protect it while she was gone, because any things you had in a lodging house were not safe. He went, he identified her. There was no one to pay for her funeral. And when she was buried, he was the only person who attended. That is a difference between the last 2 women I profiled. There were people who loved them and missed them. They had family. It's extremely sad to me that Elizabeth Stride didn't have that. I hope you've enjoyed this story about Elizabeth Stride. It's unfortunate how many people the Ripper was able to kill, and all of their lives are so sad and so unfortunate, and most of it was due to how women were treated by the Victorian era. If you lost a man, you ended up on the streets, basically. So, ladies, if we had lived during the Victorian era, all I can say is be extremely careful about who you marry and hope to goodness he's a good man and that he doesn't die. Because that's all it takes to get you living on the street or being in the workhouse, which if you watch the episode about Polly Nichols, you will see how awful the workhouses were. Thank you for joining me. Next time, we will move on to victim number 4, Catherine Eddowes, who was killed the same night as Elizabeth Stride. I will see you all next time.